Hi and welcome back to Bike Speed. So this week we're going to deal with this Claud Butler Urban. Now it's a perfect name for a perfect bike in that we do read the comments in the comment section, and several of you have said that you do love the fact that we do ordinary bikes from time to time. So this is that perfect ordinary urban bike. First thing you can see here, again as I mentioned in last week's video, top 5 common problems: headset bearings that are too tight. This has to be the number one. What this causes is a bike that you can't ride with no hands, they tram line, and there was another reason which we'll show you further on in the video why this bike would have been quite unstable, so watch out for that as I explain it. Another one is this very common chain that is way beyond life. What happens when that is that far worn? It wears your cassette, it wears your chain rings, it wears your derailleur wheel, jockey wheels, everything becomes worn. Now, as you can see from my fingers in this derailleur, this bike was on the other scale of a dry bike, wet bike. This bike was heavily oiled, very, very wet, and I would always prefer to see a bike in this state than in a dry state, but none the more for that. You gradually build up sand deposits that stick to that oil, as you can see on my fingers there. So it's important to have a bike like this cleaned down, serviced, and to keep the longevity of the parts that are on the bike. So the first thing we're going to do is strip down the bike, get everything into the ultrasonic clean. You can see here how pasty and dry, well not dry, sorry, how pasty and wet this bike is. You see that paste in my fingers. Again, my pet hate, the installation sticker there that's never been removed, so we get rid of that. Like I say, we begin to get everything stripped down. Everything goes in the ultrasonic cleaner before we can start to re-lubricate and re-oil the parts correctly. Now this was the complaint I was going to say to you about the steering. This washer was the wrong side of the forks. Now what that would do, that would throw the wheel 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters one side of the center of the pivot point of the forks. But you've got to double that, because if it's 1 or 2 centimeters to the left, it's also missing 1 or 2 centimeters to the right. So the wheel effectively is 4 mil incorrect either way. Now when you're steering, that can cause the steering to be a little bit inconsistent and a little bit weighty one way. It can stop it squaring up, and then coupled with those stiff headset bearings, that could be an issue on this bike. But anyway, we're going to resolve all those issues as we go. So now everything's coming out the ultrasonic cleaner. We have a 6 litre ultrasonic cleaner. We wash everything down afterwards, which is what we're doing here before we re-lubricate them, which we're going to explain all our oils and things. We have done a video specifically on that, so check out the channel for that one, but we're just going to run through the greases and oils that we're actually using on this bike. So first up we have the copper grease. I often refer to it as copper slip. From the days when my dad built rally cars, he always used to say, pass me the copper slip, and it's just a slip of the tongue that is now stuck. Copper slip has very little copper in the grease. A lot of people say dissimilar metals and the galvanic scale, but actually there's more anti-seize and anti-corrosion properties within this grease than ever there is. The copper is a very minuscule ingredient within copper grease. It's a bit of a false name really, but the beauty of that is it does stop anti-seizing and anti-corrosion on parts. Then we use the multi-purpose grease, so we use copper slip on threads, multi-purpose grease on any surfaces that we want to be smooth, so we'll use those maybe on axles that are touching inner axle, you know, like your quick release axle, things like your square taper. And then we use a very thin oil like this on all the pivot points, so on like your derailleurs, the chain. You're always, as I've mentioned before, you're always trying to lubricate the rollers in a chain, so you want a very thin oil to go in there. So we put that into a syringe with a blunt needle on the end, so we don't dispense it from its original container. We put it in our own syringe. We also use Loctite 222. This is a low strength Loctite designed for up to M6 bolts, so ideal for a bike, because you can still remove the part, but it can just stop some bolts from undoing on themselves. Most bolts, if you torque them up to the manufacturer specification, you won't have an issue with that. So I do use that on derailleurs, but that's one of the few places I do. And then we use a premium grease like this. This is very buttery in your fingers, this premium grease. And I use this on all my bearing work, spring work, especially on headset bearings and wheel bearings and things where they're loose bearings. I use the premium grease. Again, like I say, it's a very buttery grease, slightly thicker than the multi-purpose grease, a little bit better for holding bearings when you're working with them. So these are the greases that we're going to be using today, and we'll explain them through on the next part that we show on this video. So we're using the premium grease. Again, this is a rotating part, so although it's not a bearing, it's effectively a spinning part, so we use the premium grease. The Loctite 222 there just to hold the bolts that hold this together, just so that we know that's not likely to come undone. Copper slip on a thread here, multi-purpose grease here, the white grease on the part that actually runs up and down inside the tube of the adjuster just to stop that seizing. and also stop the cable seizing in there. Then we use the thin grease on the pivot points, and then again the premium grease on the spring. Same here, thin grease, thin oil on the pivots. Same on this derailleur, we're using the thin oil on the pivot, white grease on the actual shaft, and copper slip on the threads. So that's sort of our thought process amongst the greases that we use. And now we're just going to address this headset. It was a little bit seized, so we just used a little bit of anti-seize there just to get that off. We actually just used WD-40 on there. Now you can see from these bearings, they're nice and moist. They're actually not too worn. The issue with this was actually adjustment. It was just tightened up too tight. But for the purpose of the video and the fact that they cost very, very little for those races, we're actually just going to replace the races. It seems almost pointless to put old races back in with fresh grease in this situation. So that's what we're doing there. Premium grease, brand new bearings in a race. Again, round the cup at the bottom. Brand new bearings, a little bit more grease, begin to rebuild it. I just use a little bit of white grease coming up here, just on the spacers alone. I don't use that on the top of the stem. In fact, I actually wipe that down with a rag, as you can see, to take the excess off, because you want that stem to grip that steerer tube. But again, you have to do it to the right torque. So we just loosely do those up just to check our adjustments, and you can see there that was spinning nicely. Now with this bike, we actually used a little bit of degreaser on the frame as well, because it was so thick with oil here. If we just washed that down, it would have just smeared it all over the frame. So we just used a little bit of degreaser just to wipe this excess off the frame. Before then, we're just using our soap spray to wash the bike down. If you're new to the channel, please do subscribe, do comment, because one other thing you will notice here, one, we've talked through our greases, which was asked for, and the second is, if you notice the background's not moving much, we have actually moved to a tripod, which a lot of people had said in the comments they felt our videos were a little jumpy and we needed a tripod. What you have to remember with this is we don't actually earn any money really out of YouTube at the moment. We're hoping to grow it to that stage, but this is all coming out of our own pockets, so it took us a few weeks to gather the money together to be able to get a tripod for our videos, but hopefully you'll be pleased with the way they're a little bit more steady. And then so we just did the disc there, which we've explained in other videos, where we just rub that down. And I actually used a degreaser on the drive side of this wheel because centrifugal force had thrown all that oil out over the wheel and over the spokes. So just to clean it up, we just degrease that as well. And then we use a brake cleaner after we've sanded that disc down, just to clean off any excess that may be left on there before we put a new free hub on, torqued up to 40 Newton meters. And you can see here how loose those disc bolts were for the rotors. They were same front and back, very loose. So we also removed the brake pads, give them a little clean up. So we had loosened off all the settings on that, took out these brake pads, cleaned up the actual framework, skimmed down the pads, and you can see how that one on that I'm now pointing to, how impregnated that is in comparison with the one above it, which we've cleaned down. I always put a little bit of copper slip on the back of these because they're very prone to corroding. So again, just sort of future proofing it so that between services it should save any of that corrosion before we begin to rebuild the bike. If you do follow us on YouTube here, do head over to our Instagram account. We often put little stories on the Instagram story of little jobs we're doing along the way that are unusual, but they don't warrant a video in themselves. There may be a video that would only then run for a minute or two, so we tend to do those as an Instagram story. So do head over to our Instagram and follow us over there. Please comment on these videos early because it helps with the algorithms. Like them, comment on them, share them on your social medias. It will all help us grow as a channel. The one thing we do see is our subscriber count going up. So if you do subscribe, it gives us a little bit of a boost and a lift if we have a good week with the subscribers. So do subscribe as well. You know, I know all YouTubers mention that when they're doing their YouTube videos, but it is important and it's nice when we get a little bit of a response. So like, subscribe, comment, follow us over on Instagram, then we'll know that it's happening for ourselves. So now we're just adjusting up everything. We just adjust the brakes and the gears and getting everything nice and settled. And now we're just going to run through the entire bike with a torque wrench. So any fitting that we can get to adequately, we'll torque up just to make sure that it's right. We get asked a lot of the time what the torque wrench settings are. Most components have torque setting on them. If they haven't, you can look that component up online, and especially Shimano, they have a lot of PDF files where you can get the correct torques and everything for their component parts in component phase, you know, so that jockey wheels and things, you can get all that. We just checked through the bottle cage things here. You can see there was one loose there. We do those by hand. I never torque those because they're prone to coming over torqued and moving the fitting within the bike. And then we give that bike a little pump up the tyres, a little wipe down with a little bit of silicone spray just to really finish off. So again, as I've mentioned before, this is a Claud Butler Urban, and you can see what a huge difference we've made to this just with a regular service, lining up those stem adapters there, and new chain and new cassette, and everything's really looking nice. This boat will do thousands of miles now and is ready to be re-oiled by its owner before we maybe reservice it next time. So thanks for watching again. We'll see you again next week. All I can say is thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this video.